I have always been the kind of person who puts others before herself. For over 30 years, I dedicated my life to my son, David, and my husband, Peter. I believed that sacrificing my own needs was the truest expression of love and responsibility. But now, as I look back on the years, I realize just how much of myself I gave away, how many parts of me vanished into the shadows of their needs. My story begins with the dreams I once had. Before David was born, I had a modest career as a photographer. I loved capturing moments, the light, the faces, the stories frozen in time. But everything changed when I became a mother. I gave up my job, my ambitions, my independence to center my world around David's health and happiness. Those early years were exhausting but filled with hope. One sacrifice was the career I walked away from, with a mixture of fear and resolve. I told myself that photography could wait, or that it was less important than being present for my child. But as the years passed, the camera gathered dust, and my dreams dimmed. I swapped art galleries for late-night shifts at the grocery store to make ends meet, because my husband's job was unstable and unpredictable. Another sacrifice was my social life. Invitations stopped coming because I often declined them. Friends drifted away, misunderstanding or judging my choices. I rarely complained. Instead, I grew accustomed to the quiet isolation. I convinced myself that love required seclusion, and that being busy proved my dedication. Deep inside, loneliness settled like a shadow, but I ignored it because I was needed elsewhere. The third sacrifice was my own emotional well-being. I ignored the aches, the exhaustion, and the moments when I wanted to scream or cry, but did neither. I pushed down my frustrations and desires to keep the peace. I normalized suffering as part of being a good wife and mother, even though my heart longed for more. Understanding, rest, perhaps recognition. I can still see vividly 2 moments that defined these years. One was the night David was rushed to the emergency room with a severe asthma attack. I was working 2 jobs then, but I dropped everything and ran to him, frantic and praying. Peter was distant, blaming stress for his hesitation to rush, but I refused to let fear or exhaustion slow me. That night I swore to always be there for my son, no matter the cost. Another memory is a quiet evening in our small living room, where Peter and I sat in silence after dinner. I asked him if he noticed how tired I was, and he replied curtly that everyone was tired, and that I needed to be stronger. I swallowed my hurt, deciding my pain wasn't worth mention. This moment etched a deep loneliness within me, being present but unseen, speaking but unheard. Financially, things were tight. I juggled multiple jobs, from grocery clerk to cleaning service worker, just to pay bills that kept piling up. We lived in a small, aging house filled with the scent of old books, brewed coffee, and faded memories. Its peeling wallpaper and worn furniture were silent witnesses to years of hard work and sacrifice. The garden was wild, neglected, much like my own spirit. How others saw me and how I saw myself were worlds apart. Everyone admired my strength, my sacrifices, and my tireless devotion. They called me selfless and strong, praising the stamina that kept my family steady. Yet inside I felt broken and invisible. The woman who had given so much but lost herself, bit by bit. The admiration felt hollow because it failed to reach the woman behind the smiles. Most days I moved through life on autopilot, normalizing my suffering with a stiff smile. I had learned not to expect empathy or gratitude. I made peace with constantly feeling drained, depriving myself of basic needs like rest, emotional support, or social connection. I confided only in the quiet of a dark bedroom when no one else watched or listened. Looking back, I realized how deeply I neglected myself while nurturing those I loved. I sacrificed my career, my friendships, and my emotional health for a family that depended on me but rarely saw my sacrifice. I was a caretaker who forgot to care for herself. This invisible burden shaped my days, trapping me within invisible walls of duty and silent suffering. Now standing at this crossroads, I see my home as more than just a physical place. It is the container of all these sacrifices. The faded photos on the walls, the cluttered kitchen, and the solitary armchair all whisper stories of a woman who loved fiercely, yet forgot to love herself. The pain of this realization is sharp, but it also opens a door One toward transformation, toward remembering who I truly am beyond the roles imposed on me. This is my true beginning, acknowledging the years of sacrifice, the cost of invisibility, and the deep yearning for something more. The woman who gave everything will soon have to learn how to give to herself, and that will be the hardest and most important journey of all. I remember exactly the moment when everything inside me shifted, the moment when the fog of years began to lift and I finally saw the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. It was in that cold hospital corridor, sitting on the rough wooden bench with peeling paint beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, my body still shaking from the shock and humiliation Peter's abandonment had caused. But beyond the trembling hands and the knot that tightened in my stomach, an intense clarity broke through, sharp, undeniable, and almost physical. This wasn't just one cruel act. It was the painful culmination of decades of being taken for granted, of sacrifices made silently without acknowledgement or reciprocation. All those years of dedicating myself entirely to my son and husband, giving up my career, my friendships, my needs, had led me here to this painful truth. I was invisible to those I loved most. As I sat there, the sterile hospital smells swirling around me, a mix of antiseptic and old linen. I felt something inside me roar softly but fiercely. Not anger or despair, at least not fully, but recognition. A voice grew louder inside my chest, saying, "This is not your life. You deserve so much more than this." The painful love I had offered so freely had never been returned on equal terms, and I understood now that I had normalized my own neglect, convinced myself that suffering was simply the price of love. Memories flooded in with startling insistence. I thought back to the sleepless nights spent beside David's hospital bed, watching his fragile chest rise and fall, praying for him to breathe easier. How I had thrown myself into protecting him, anchoring my entire being to his needs. And yet, even then, the sacrifice came with a heavy price that was invisible to others. I remembered the chilly night when Peter asked, almost coldly, why I was always so tired and too weak to handle everything. I had smiled and said, "I'm fine," when inside I felt shattered and unseen. That small denial became a symbol of the pattern I had been trapped in, silencing my pain to preserve the facade. Another memory pierced through, the hastily celebrated birthdays, the unanswered calls, the endless days where my own desires were ignored or forgotten. Each recollection cut deep, revealing how far I had drifted from the person I once was before family obligations consumed me. My gaze drifted to that battered bench beneath me. The cracked wood and peeling paint looked like a metaphor for myself, worn, chipped, but still holding on. That bench, once a place of rest, now symbolized both the comfort and the confinement of a life filled with quiet surrender. Slowly I rose, legs weak, but heart pounding with new resolve. The hospital corridor echoed with distant footsteps and soft murmurs, but I was stepping into something entirely new. The cold night air outside bit into my skin as I began the walk home, each step feeling like a reclaiming of space I hadn't allowed myself before. The empty streets were quiet, but full of possibility. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that merged with mine as I walked. The chill sharpened my senses and reminded me of the stark contrast between where I had been and where I was headed. With each step, the weight in my chest moved from suffocation to determination. Along the way, I reflected on those memories anew, now seen through different eyes. The frantic care I had given David wasn't just love. It was a refusal to accept anything less than his well-being. But in doing so, I had sacrificed my own well-being without question. Peter's dismissiveness no longer felt like simple indifference. It was an emotional wound that demanded acknowledgement. The tiny, forgotten moments of disappointment no longer seemed petty but critical markers of my erasure. As I reached my worn apartment, the familiar scent of stale coffee and old wood greeted me. But my perception shifted. The walls, once confining, now felt like the foundation for change. The cluttered shelves and faded curtains whispered of a long life lived. But under that, I sensed a space waiting to be claimed by the woman I was becoming. That night, alone in the dim light, I finally allowed the truth to settle fully in my bones. I was no longer willing to be the invisible caretaker. the woman whose sacrifices were invisible and unappreciated. Despite the lingering ache and uncertainty, a fierce seed of determination took root. I promised myself that I would no longer be erased, no longer bend beneath the weight of unreturned love and silent suffering. The journey ahead was unclear, perhaps even frightening, but it was mine to take. This awakening, though small and fragile, became a beacon in the darkness, a beginning crack in the shell that had enclosed me for too long. I felt my own heartbeat steady in my chest, strong and relentless, as though echoing a new rhythm, one that belonged not to others' expectations but to my own reclaimed self. In that quiet moment, I chose to step off the path of sacrifice and invisibility and toward a life where I mattered again. The transformation had begun. The moment I truly recognized what had been happening to me was like waking up underwater, disoriented, desperate for air, yet finally aware that I'd been drowning for so long. It came suddenly, unexpected during the last few agonizing hours of that horrid event, when I was humiliated in front of those I had sacrificed everything for. I felt my body shrink inside itself, trembling, heart pounding with a mix of shame and fury. But then, through that haze of pain, a sharp, clear thought cut through the noise. This is not love. This is not respect. This is control. And I have allowed it. Walking away from the gathering felt like stepping across a threshold. The noisy chatter, the clinking glasses, the false laughter, it all blurred behind me. My footsteps on the cracked pavement echoed in the cool evening air, slow and heavy, yet resolute. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the chill of the night seeped through my coat, a cold reminder of how alone I had been feeling. But in that cold, a fierce heat began to rise within me. Memories surged unbidden. I saw the times I stayed late at work, ignoring my own exhaustion to cover for his endless overtime. The nights spent waiting up for my son, only to be met with silence or dismissive words. The friends I stopped seeing, the dreams I quietly buried to avoid rocking the boat. All those sacrifices, once swallowed whole and unnoticed, now screamed their truth at me. I wasn't just tired. I was invisible. It's strange how clarity can cut like a razor. I realized I had been hurting myself by trying to be invisible. I thought sacrificing my needs was what made me valuable, but it only chained me tighter to that role. The truth dawned fiercely. By giving everything, I had nothing left to give myself. For a long moment I stood frozen on the curb, battling thoughts swirling like a storm. Who am I, if not a caretaker, a martyr? If I stop being that, do I lose my meaning? That question terrorized me. But another answered back, stronger. I am whole in myself, even without their approval. I deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be protected, including by me. A sudden impulse pushed me forward. No longer willing to be the quiet shadow fading into the background, I decided to reclaim my space. But I was also trembling, fear tangled with hope. What if I failed? What if I was forever alone? Even so, the seed of determination took root deep within. As I resumed the walk home, an old leather handbag I'd carried for years seemed heavier, as if filled with the weight of all those years of silence and sacrifice. I wondered how many battles it held inside its worn pockets, battles I had lost by staying silent. There on that deserted street bathed in the cold moonlight, I promised myself I wouldn't let it be so anymore. Tonight marked the beginning of a new chapter. Each step home held significance. I passed places that once symbolized the corners of my world. The familiar cafe where I used to drown in work while ignoring my own dreams. The park bench where I often sat alone, content to stay small and unnoticed. Now they felt different. Like landmarks on a map of my past I was finally ready to leave behind. Entering my apartment, the familiar creak of the floor greeted me, both friend and witness to my quiet years of sacrifice. The dim light, the smell of old books and faint traces of rain from the window, wrapped around me like an old shawl. But here, in this small space that once felt like confinement, I let out a long breath. I ran my fingers over the dusty table, feeling the rough edges beneath my palms, a reminder that nothing was perfect, but everything could still be shaped anew. Pausing by my small window, I pulled back the faded curtain just enough to see the moon's soft glow spill in. The silvery light illuminated floating dust particles, which twisted gently in the still air. I imagined those were the pieces of myself I'd forgotten, gathering now to be collected and mended. The fragile light contrasted sharply with the harsh shadows that had ruled my life. Old memories replayed, but now they shifted. A birthday party where my offers to help were ignored. A Christmas dinner where no one noticed my absence unless it was convenient. All felt painfully clear under this new light. I saw selflessness I once mistook for love, and loneliness I camouflaged as strength. Inside me, the storm softened into calm resolve. The ache inside throbbed with the promise of change. I was no longer a silent servant to others' needs, but a woman awakening to her own. My breath deepened. My chest felt lighter, like the tight cage in my ribs was beginning to open. Suddenly, the worn handbag slumped by the door caught my eye again. It was just an object, yet it symbolized everything. I reached down and picked it up, brushing off a forgotten crumb. It was time to change what I carried inside, and what I chose to hold on to. That night, as I prepared to rest, I felt the old pain, but it no longer ruled me. In its place blossomed something new, hope and fierce determination. I vowed silently to myself, this is the last time I carry their burden alone. And in that moment, with the moonlight soft on my face and a gentle breeze whispering through the open window, I made the first trembling step toward reclaiming my life, no longer invisible, no longer silent, but finally, unapologetically myself. The morning after that pivotal night of clarity and quiet determination settled over me like a fragile dawn. I woke with my body still weighed down by exhaustion, but beneath the fatigue stirred a resolve stronger than I had felt in years. For so long, my life had moved in the rhythm of self-sacrifice and silent endurance, but now I recognized that real change required deliberate action, not dramatic or explosive gestures, but calm, measured steps toward reclaiming my autonomy. I began with the smallest but most symbolic act I could imagine, looking myself in the face. Standing before the cracked mirror in the bathroom, I studied the reflection staring back. Lines traced the years of hard work and heartache. The eyes were tired, yet beneath their weariness, a spark glimmered, a faint light of defiance and potential rebirth. I whispered to myself, this is the woman who will no longer be invisible. This quiet affirmation fueled the first concrete step. Without announcing it to anyone, I reached out to Carlos, the ambulance driver who had shown empathy and kindness during those bleak hours at the hospital. Unlike the cold indifference surrounding me, Carlos's calm presence had offered a rare sanctuary. When I called him, my voice was soft but steady, as I asked if we could meet after his shift. His initial surprise was evident, but he agreed without hesitation, perhaps sensing the significance behind my request. Over the next few days, I prepared carefully, methodically. This was not an impulsive rebellion, but a precise untangling of responsibility that had worn me to the bone. I gathered critical documents, medical reports, identification papers, keys, everything that represented the guardianship and care I had always had to hold, alone. I folded them into an envelope, nothing fancy or dramatic, but an object heavy with meaning. This envelope was my symbolic torch, passed from my weary hands into a steadier hold. When I met Carlos later, in the quiet corner of a nearby cafe, I felt a swell of something unforgettable, the mingling of fear, relief, and the faint taste of newfound hope. Handing him the envelope without a word was a silent pact between us. This was the beginning of something new, a relinquishing of burdens I had carried alone for far too long. News of my decision spread quickly, and the reactions came in waves. Peter, upon hearing, looked stunned and incredulous. "You can't just hand David over to a stranger," he scolded, his voice thick with disbelief and anger. But I met his gaze with calm resolve. "I'm doing what's best for all of us," I said quietly, the conviction ringing clear, including myself. Whispers followed me. Friends who once lauded my selflessness now questioned my judgment. Some labeled me selfish or unstable. Yet, amid the whispers, I stood firm, unmoved. The doubts and judgments no longer had the power to erode the fragile fortress I was building. The contents of the envelope were simple: a set of keys, David's medical information, and instructions for his care and transport. Though humble in form, its significance was immense. a physical embodiment of my first real step away from invisibility and surrender. Carlos's acceptance was quiet, but unmistakably respectful, a reminder that not all ties in my life were shackles. Throughout this quiet revolution, my body became a battlefield of opposing forces. Waves of empowerment surged through me, yet fear and uncertainty lurked like shadows at the edges. Was this really the right path? Could I face the consequences? Moments of hesitation flared but were swiftly extinguished by the fire of necessity and self-respect that now burned fiercely within. Peter's response evolved from confusion to aggression. His attempts to regain control grew more persistent, pleading, accusing, trying to guilt me back into the familiar patterns. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded during a tense confrontation, his voice breaking under the weight of his frustration. "We did everything for this family." I held my ground, voice steady and clear. "I gave all I could. Now it's my turn to care for myself. No apology, no justification, just a truth long suppressed." Our exchanges, though brief and fraught, opened a new chapter. It was a language neither of us fully spoke before, respect and boundaries replacing control and submission. Uncomfortable yet necessary, it laid the groundwork for transformation. The process required unwavering commitment. Old habits beckoned like sirens, forcing me to repeat pleas to relent. Friends, once allies, challenged my decisions, their confusion sometimes sliding into condemnation. One afternoon, a friend appeared unannounced, tears in her eyes, demanding explanations. "Why are you pushing us away? This isn't like you." I looked at her steadily and said, "I'm changing. If you can't accept that, then I can only hope you'll understand one day." There was no room left for doubt or hesitation. Every firm refusal, every quiet no, reshaped the boundaries I had long neglected. I felt my body respond. My shoulders, once burdened with invisible weight, grew lighter. My breath deepened. My heart unfolded, making space for a self I had ignored. Yet, in the quiet moments, fleeting doubts crept in. Would I lose my son? Would I destroy the family I loved? Each time I confronted those fears with honesty, reminding myself that honoring my needs was not betrayal, but survival and renewal. This transformation wasn't marked by thunderous upheavals, but by steady, persistent waves reshaping my life. The woman who once whispered acquiescence now spoke with quiet power. I was stepping out from the shadows, reclaiming a place that had been long denied. With each passing day, I sensed a subtle rebirth stirring within me, a quiet but profound awakening. The small acts, the handing over of an envelope, setting firm limits, choosing myself, were the first tremors of a revolution inside me, building toward freedom and a new identity. This was only the beginning, but it was mine. The weight of invisibility began to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing light of hope and self-ownership. The days that followed my quiet assertion of autonomy descended upon me like a relentless storm. I had broken free from the invisible chains that bound me for so long, yet the price of that freedom began to manifest in unanticipated ways. The very people whose love and support I had sacrificed decades to maintain now turned their confusion and anger into weapons aimed at dragging me back into the life I was trying to escape. A life of silence, submission, and invisibility. Peter was the first to launch a campaign of emotional manipulation. His voice, once merely frustrated, now carried a venomous mix of betrayal and outrage. He summoned me repeatedly, whether through phone calls, messages, or unexpected visits, each plea layered with guilt and coercion. "How could you do this to us? To me? After everything we built? You're tearing this family apart," he insisted in one phone call, his tone equal parts hurt and accusation. His words sought to weaponize the years of sacrifice I had quietly offered, painting me as selfish and ungrateful. But his tactics did not end there. He alternated between cold indifference and bursts of desperate pleading, a dangerous dance designed to confuse and wear me down. Once, during an unannounced visit, I found myself cornered in the kitchen as he tried to argue his way back into control. "You don't understand what you're risking," he said, voice low and urgent. "David needs stability. This chaos isn't good for any of us." Yet the chaos was already inside me. The chaos of realizing my worth had been ignored for too long. Despite his pressure, I remained firm, my heart hammering, but my words steady. I am creating stability for myself. I need to be whole before I can be there for anyone else. His frustration only deepened, but it no longer dictated my actions. I had learned to recognize the patterns. His attempts to intimidate or guilt me were not just about concern but control. I refused to step back into those chains. Family members followed Peter's lead, voicing their disappointment thinly veiled as concern. "Are you sure this isn't just anger speaking?" a distant cousin asked, gently but pointedly in a phone conversation. Her words carried the assumption that my break from tradition was a passing phase, a rebellion to be endured, rather than a legitimate stand for my own life. I stopped answering some calls, ignoring messages that flooded my phone with questions, accusations, and pleas for reconciliation. It became a protective barrier, a necessary silence I only occasionally pierced to remind desperate voices that I needed time and space. Friends and acquaintances that once admired my sacrifices began to distance themselves. Some whispered that I was ungrateful. Others simply erased me from their lives, uncomfortable with the upheaval I introduced. The small community I had once counted on showed fractures, and I had to navigate this new loneliness with fragile steps. Amid the torrent of rejection, there was one who tried to mediate, a mutual friend who called periodically, attempting to keep peace, urging conversations and compromises. Her voice was gentle but insistent, embodying the social pressures to maintain appearances. I listened but did not yield, aware that any concession threatened the fragile boundaries I was erecting. Within this maelstrom, I confronted moments of isolation heavier than anything I had faced before. The nights were long, and the silence of the apartment deepened the ache inside. Doubts itself crept in during these vulnerable hours. Was I being too harsh? Did I push away those who loved me? Could I survive this alone? But solitude also became my refuge. It was in the quiet that I began to forge new limits, both internal and external. I practiced saying no without apology. I redefined my relationships, no longer allowing guilt to dictate my actions. This was not an easy path, each boundary tested, each refusal challenged, but it was necessary. A particularly painful confrontation arose with my sister, once an ally, now questioning my choices. During an unexpected visit, her eyes searched mine with a mixture of bewilderment and hurt. "What are you really doing? You're breaking us apart," she whispered. "This isn't who you are." Her words cut me deeply, revealing how much my transformation unsettled even those closest to me. Yet, I held my ground. "I'm becoming who I always was underneath everything," I replied softly but firmly. "This isn't destruction, it's reclamation." The pressure was unyielding. Attempts at contact became more frequent and urgent. 3 times in 1 week I received calls and messages from Peter alone, each increasingly desperate in tone. The first was a late-night phone call begging me to reconsider. The second, a voicemail full of accusations of selfishness and madness. The third, a text message simply stating, "We're falling apart. Don't leave us behind." I resisted the urge to respond immediately. I allowed myself moments of vulnerability, then recentered, reminding myself that my needs were valid and my choices necessary. This period of retaliatory pressure was taxing physically and emotionally. My heart raced with anxiety during unexpected calls. My stomach clenched during confrontations with family members. Yet, beneath the stress grew an unshakable resolve that I was not going to lose myself again. Slowly but surely, I began to build new routines, not just around what I said yes or no to, but around how I listened to myself. I started journaling, noting moments of strength and weakness, acknowledging fears but not surrendering to them. In this process, I forged new, firmer boundaries. I declined visits that drained me. I refused calls that tried to reset me to the old ways. I learned to protect my space, even when it felt lonely or misunderstood. Transformation, I realized, was not a single moment, but a series of decisions, small acts of courage layered over time that defined a new existence. Though the social fallout was severe, especially from family, my inner voice grew louder, more confident. I was no longer hiding behind sacrifice or people-pleasing. I was becoming whole, despite the tension and isolation. Amid the avalanche of doubt and retaliation, a quiet revolution unfolded. In claiming my ground, I not only reshaped relationships but reclaimed my soul. I was no longer just the woman who sacrificed for others. I was a woman, asserting her dignity, demanding respect, and forging a new life on her own terms. And with every challenge, every attempt to pull me back, my resolve deepened. This was no longer just survival. It was the reclamation of self, and I was ready to fight for it. During this tumultuous time, as I navigated the fractures between myself and those I had once considered my anchor, I discovered a hidden truth that altered everything. It was a revelation that had eluded me for years, buried beneath layers of sacrifice, denial, and unspoken pain. A truth that reframed my entire narrative and freed me from some of the heaviest chains I had carried. It came unexpectedly, through a worn box tucked away in the back of an old closet, a box I had not opened in years. As I cleaned the apartment one afternoon, trying to find order in the chaos of my shifting life, the box caught my eye. Inside I found letters, photographs, and documents that unearthed a secret long kept from me. One letter stood out among the faded pages, a letter addressed to me but never delivered. Its ink was smudged and letters faded, but its contents were clear enough to shake me to my core. The letter was from my late mother, written during a time when I was young and still hopeful. In it, she confessed that she had hidden the truth about my father's abandonment, the reasons behind her silence, and the extent to which she had suffered alone. She wrote about betrayals I had never known, choices made to protect me, yet filled with painful omissions. Reading those words, I felt a torrent of emotion, anger, sorrow, confusion, all tangled with a surprising sense of relief. The secret the letter revealed redefined so much of my emotional history. It explained unspoken absences, betrayals disguised as protection, and the invisible wounds passed down through generations. A photograph inside the box showed my mother and father in happier times, but also hinted at fractures I had never seen as a child. They smiled, yes, but their eyes told a different story, a story of sacrifices concealed and trust broken. The discovery was a paradox, painful yet liberating. It uncovered betrayals that explained the restless ache inside me, but also freed me from misplaced guilt and self-blame. I had often wondered if my sacrifices and failures were my fault, if the patterns repeating in my life were somehow deserved or inherited without end. Now I understood the deeper context. I was not the only one to suffer silently, nor the only one to endure the weight of hidden truths and imposed silence. This revelation gave me compassion for myself and for my mother, who had borne her own heavy burdens in solitude. The physical act of uncovering the box and poring through its contents felt like excavating my own buried history. I traced each letter with trembling fingers, letting the memories and new understanding ripple through me. The room was quiet except for the steady ticking of an old clock, the sun casting long shadows across the floor. The stillness offered space to absorb the magnitude of the revelation. Following this, I spent hours reflecting in solitude, processing the complex emotions swelling within. Sadness for the losses that could never be reclaimed, anger for the years wasted in confusion, but also a growing sense of liberation. That knowledge, even when painful, carries the power to transform. In my journal, I wrote down my thoughts, trying to make sense of the tangled web of past betrayals and present courage. "We are all products of stories we only partly know," I scribbled. Witnessing my mother's silence, and now my own, helped me break the myth that my suffering was unique or my fault. It was instead part of a larger, painful pattern. This discovery shifted my perspective on my relationships, especially with Peter and David. It offered clues to the dysfunction and distance, while urging me to seek new ways of interaction, grounded less in sacrifice and more in our honesty. The secret I uncovered was not a chain but a key, a painful, complex key that unlocked parts of my past and gave me room to breathe. It lifted some of the invisible weights I had carried unknowingly and freed me to imagine new possibilities. With this new understanding, I found moments of unexpected peace. Tears came freely, washing away years of hurt. I allowed myself to mourn the losses and the illusions I had carried, but I also embraced hope that my story could still change course. I realized that the truths we hide rarely protect us. Instead, they shape us, sometimes in destructive ways, and sometimes as a catalyst for healing. My mother's secret, once a weight, had become a source of strength. It connected me to her in a deeper way than years of silence ever could. This revelation did not erase the pain of the present struggles, nor the looming challenges ahead, but it gave me a foundation, firm and true, to stand on as I continued to reclaim my life. I made a quiet vow to carry honesty forward, to live more openly, to speak my truth without fear or shame. The secret I unearthed was not a story to bury, but a lesson to carry, a light to guide my next steps. In the days following this discovery, I began to strategize differently. No longer mired in blame or self-recrimination, I could approach my situation with clearer eyes and steadier heart. This truth became a shield and a sword, protection from old patterns, and a weapon to carve out new paths. I settled into this new balance slowly, letting the revelation ripple outward through my life. It gave me the courage to say no to guilt, to stand firm amidst pressure, and to nurture the wounds rather than bury them. Through this hidden truth, I found not only freedom, but a connection across time, a legacy of strength woven through pain, passing from mother to daughter, handed down not as a curse, but as a call to resilience. And in that call, I chose to answer, ready to face what came next with open eyes and a brave heart. The day I confronted Peter face to face was not marked by anger or explosive confrontation, as I had once imagined. Instead, it was a moment of quiet, unyielding truth. I had spent months rebuilding myself, shedding layers of silence and invisibility, fueled by the revelation of my mother's hidden past and the steady resolve I had cultivated. I knew this meeting was inevitable, the final crossing point between the life I had been forced to live and the life I was determined to claim. We met in the living room of the small apartment where every chipped table corner and faded curtain carried echoes of years together. The room felt heavy with unspoken words as I faced him across the narrow space. The air was thick with tension, but an odd stillness hovered, a calm before a storm neither of us wished, but both prepared for. I looked directly at Peter, not as the young woman who had bent silently beneath his indifference, but as the woman who now understood her worth. "We need to talk," I said softly, yet the firmness in my voice carried an unmistakable command. He sat stiffly on the worn sofa, eyes clouded with disbelief and frustration. "What do you want from me?" "Respect," I replied in a measured tone. "Respect for the woman I am, not the person you thought you could shape or hide." He scoffed but said nothing. I continued. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or approval. I'm here to state what I need, and that's to be seen for who I am, not invisible beneath years of sacrifice." Our conversation unfolded in a series of short, sharp exchanges that cut through years of misunderstanding and silence. "You've changed," he said, tone edged with something that might have been fear. "You're not the woman I married." "No," I said simply. "I'm the woman I always was, but I got lost for a long time in the shadows you cast." "Why now, after everything we've been through?" His voice cracked, a rawness beneath the anger. "Because I finally gave myself permission," I answered. "Permission to live honestly, to stop hiding behind your needs and my silence." The room felt charged, each sentence a small battle fought with words instead of fists. Peter struggled visibly, the years of control he once held slipping through his fingers. "You're abandoning us." His voice was a mix of accusation and desperation. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I said. "I'm reclaiming myself, and if that means you feel lost, it's a pain I'll bear." My gaze held steady, unflinching. For a moment, silence filled the room, thick and uneasy. Then Peter's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from him, but no relief replacing it. It was clear this confrontation was not a victory for either of us, but a necessary reckoning. In that charged quietness, I found the strength to say the words that had long remained unspoken. "I cannot keep living in the shadows of neglect and betrayal. I won't disappear for anyone anymore." He looked up, his eyes searching mine for traces of the woman he thought he knew. Instead, I delivered a declaration, as sharp and clear as glass breaking. respect me, or watch me walk away. Peter's shoulders tensed, but for once he said no more. His silence was both defeat and concession. I stood then, feeling the weight of years lift as I walked toward the door. With one last look, I said, "This is the end of what was, and the start of what will be. I'm done waiting for approval or forgiveness." Turning away, I stepped out into the world beyond that worn doorway, a world where I no longer carried the burden of invisibility. The air outside felt fresher, sharper, as though the act of confrontation itself had cleared the stale air from my lungs. I breathed deeply, tasting freedom for the first time in a long while. In that moment, I knew I wasn't just leaving a room. I was leaving behind a lifetime of silence and surrender. The confrontation did not undo the past, nor erase the pain, but it created a rupture, a break in the story where I could finally rewrite the narrative. Peter remained behind, his figure small in the threshold as I walked forward. I did not look back. The physical setting of our confrontation, the cramped living room, the familiar but faded surroundings, stood in stark contrast to the emotional vastness opening before me. Shadows clung to the corners, but I stepped into a light I was only beginning to understand. In preparation for the meeting, I had spent days steadying my heart, rehearsing my truths. The calm I maintained then was not absence of fear, but command over it. I was no longer the woman who trembled in silence. Every short sentence we exchanged was loaded with meaning, each pause pregnant with years of unspoken grievances. Our dialogue was sparse, yet powerful. "You changed. I found myself. After you left? Because I had to. Do you hate me?" "No. I pity the man who can't see the woman beside him." "I'm sorry. I accept that this is too late. Will you come back?" "No. I'm going forward." That final exchange crystallized the gulf between us and the new path I chose. Physically, I could feel my heart beat slower, steadier. The tension in my muscles eased as if releasing the last of a heavy chain. Emotionally, I felt a cocktail of liberation, tinged with sadness. A bittersweet recognition that some doors close forever to open new ones. Leaving that place, the sensation was not just of escape, but of emergence. From darkness into a space I could fill with light on my own terms. The confrontation was a rupture both painful and necessary, a definitive moment marking the end of my invisibility and the beginning of my reclamation. And as I walked away into the unfolding day, the future was a vast expanse, unknown, but mine to shape. After leaving that confrontation behind, the search for a new life truly began. I returned to my small apartment, a space that had long felt like a cage, yet now offered a canvas to redefine myself. The familiar scent of old wood and stale coffee lingered, but something inside me was different. A quiet hope, a fragile yet growing flame. Slowly, I began transforming my surroundings. I cleared out clutter that no longer served me, rearranged furniture to create open spaces where air and light might flow freely. A worn armchair reclaimed by a patchwork quilt became my sanctuary, nestled by the window where the morning sun spilled gently across well-worn floors. To mark each small step of this rebirth, I lit candles, whose flickering flames whispered of healing and renewal. My days took on a quieter rhythm, governed no longer by endless duties but by intention and care for myself. I developed small rituals, brewing tea in the morning, journaling my thoughts as dawn broke, listening to the soft rustle of leaves outside. I learned to welcome stillness, finding comfort where I had long felt only emptiness. New relationships began to weave their way into my life. A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, with silver hair and a ready smile, became a steady presence. Our shared cups of tea offered warmth and stories, a space where I could speak honestly without fear of judgment. I reconnected with a cousin who embraced me not for what I'd sacrificed, but for who I was seeking to become. These bonds, though tentative, nurtured a part of me starved for connection grounded in equality and respect. Within these growing circles, I experienced reciprocity, care given, and received in gentle balance. It was a stark contrast to the one-sided devotion I had known, and it made my heart timidly hopeful. Sensory details, once muted by exhaustion, bloomed vibrant again. The gentle warmth of sunlight on my skin, the fragrant comfort of brewing tea, the soft texture of worn quilts. Each sensation was a small joy, treasure reminding me of life's quiet beauty. Though I carried memories of sacrifice and pain, I no longer clung to them as chains. They were stories, lessons etched deep, but no longer defining my every step. I allowed tears when they came, honoring grief without letting it consume me. In those moments, I felt a tenderness toward the woman I had been and the one I was becoming. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and pink, I sat with Mrs. Thompson on the porch. We sipped tea in comfortable silence, the world softened by twilight's embrace. In that stillness, I whispered softly to myself, I am here. I am enough. That simple truth resonated deeply, filling spaces where doubt had dwelled. It was the culmination of a journey not marked by grand gestures, but by steady, deliberate steps toward self-acceptance. My home, once burdened by memories of sacrifice, now reflected my renewal. The walls, worn yet welcoming, held light instead of shadow. The air danced with the scent of jasmine candles and fresh linen, symbols of care I finally granted myself. While the future remained uncertain, the fear that once gripped me loosened its hold. I embraced the unknown with cautious optimism, ready to write chapters authored by hope rather than fear. This rebirth was not about erasing the past, but integrating it, learning from the pain, honoring the growth, and stepping forward with open eyes and a resilient heart. As night enfolded my small world, I stood by the window watching stars emerge, silent witnesses to my transformation. A profound peace settled within me, a steadfast promise that I would no longer live in the shadows. In that quiet moment, I spoke a vow to the reflection in the glass. Now strong and clear, I choose myself. Today, tomorrow, always.